Okay, so moving further into World War II today, we are actually going to be talking about the war in Europe after, of course, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The United States is joining the war, and we are going to see um, conflict today and talk about some specific battles. So pay attention to the terms. We are going to be talking about the idea of the Europe first strategy, so deal with the threat of Hitler and then deal with the threat of Japan. Summarize the course of the war in the Pacific through the summer of 1942, talk about Stalingrad, Midway, and how those battles were turning points, um, about how the Allies used North Africa to move into Europe, um, etc. So this is where we're headed today. Just a few reminders. First of all, the Japanese invasion. Oops, sorry. The Japanese invade. The the Japanese invade Manchuria. Manchuria is a Chinese territory to the north of, in the northern part of China, just to the south of Russia, just to the west, or north, I should say, of the Korean Peninsula, and then Japan is in the east. And so the Japanese do invade Manchuria. In the late 30s. Japan will leave the League of Nations in anger after the League of Nations condemns their actions. Remember that the Japanese had been an ally during World War I. They believed that they deserved an empire in the Pacific, that they needed an empire in the Pacific in order to gain increasing access to natural resources there, since they are an island nation, and they felt that the League of Nations was thwarting their attempts of power for themselves. Japan begins to create a sphere of influence in the Pacific, sort of gobbling up an occupying territory in the Pacific region. FDR will impose economic sanctions, things like freezing assets Japanese assets in U.S. banks, and imposing embargoes against natural resources, including oil. This is Japan, of course, in the dark red. That's Manchuria in the northern part of China. In the yellow, that's French Indochina, which today is Vietnam and Cambodia, which the Japanese will also occupy. And this little red line shows you what the Japanese sphere of influence was. I want you to notice where the Philippines is, sort of to the east of French Indochina. You can see the Philippines. Remember that the United States still controls the Philippines. And so look to the United States to do a lot of military staging, a lot of military operations from bases in the Philippines. Okay, so what are the goals of the countries fighting in World War II? Think about how they are similar and different. You have the Axis powers. Germany wants to dominate Europe and eliminate so-called inferior people. Italy wants to create an Italian empire in the Mediterranean region. Japan, they want to take control of the Western Pacific and East Asia. For the Allied powers, they want to defeat the Axis powers, beginning with Germany and Italy in Europe. That is the so-called European First strategy. The first blow America struck against the Axis was by fulfilling Roosevelt's promise to be the arsenal of democracy. American factories turned out millions of tons of guns, tanks, and other supplies, enough to keep the Soviets and British battling Germany for years. The problem was delivering the weapons, food, and medical supplies that fueled the Allied war machine. So how do you get them there? You guys probably, hopefully, remember from World War I the German U-boats, the submarines that were constantly battling, constantly sinking Allied ships around Britain. So if the United States is going to be sending aid in the form of food, in the form of weapons, whatever that form of that aid may take, it has to get through to the island of Britain somehow. And you see in this image, it says American sailors watch as Allied bombers attack a German U-boat, 1944. A few minutes after this photo was taken, the U-boat was sunk. So we are going to start to see fighting in the Atlantic, which we will get to momentarily. Hitler is everywhere. Churchill doesn't think the Allies are ready to directly invade Europe. So a direct invasion of Europe would be like what we see in D-Day. Churchill doesn't think that the Allies are properly trained enough, that they are supplied enough to go ahead with an all-out assault in Europe. And so the idea is to attack the periphery, so around the edges. And they're going to start in northern Africa. Italy was often referred to as the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning that it would be easier to gain entry into Europe through Italy by coming up through northern Africa. The Axis powers are controlling North Africa because of colonization. And so they have to first take northern Africa. Dwight D. Eisenhower will be the American general in charge of this operation, and he, of course, is a future president of the United States as well. So the invasion of Africa will be led by Eisenhower. He will face German troops for the first time at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass. Eisenhower will replace the general in charge of that battle with Patton. They will fight until May, when the Americans finally push the Germans back. Why Africa? It's a relatively small troop commitment. It's a way for the Allied powers to get their feet wet, to remember working with each other. These are not the same troops that were fighting in World War II, so it sort of serves as a training ground for Allied troops and commanders working together. It also helps to protect the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, if you look at that map at the very bottom, if you look at the far right where you see the British flag and it says El Alamein, that's another battle. Just to the right of that is that little waterway. That is the Suez. It's labeled as the Suez, but it's a really dark, a really light gray color. It's hard to see. The Suez Canal is an incredibly vital supply line for the British, and so they want to prevent the Suez Canal from falling into Axis hands. The picture that you see up there on the right is Erwin Rommel. Rommel is the German commander in charge of German troops in Africa. He is probably one of the most brilliant military minds in history. He is a German. So we, of course, in World War II, so we, of course, don't want to sing his praises too much, but had he been in charge of military operations for Germany, historians wonder what the outcome of the war would have ended up being. But Hitler insisted on planning everything, having a personal hand in these strategic decisions, and of course he made many strategic blunders. Rommel was blamed for many of those strategic blunders, and Hitler ends up essentially requiring that he take his own life, which he does. In El Alamein, you can see where the British flag is with the star. They're defeated, but the Germans will continue to be, the Germans will continue to be a threat in northern Africa. Oh, I forgot I could enlarge that. So now you can see where the Suez Canal is a little better. These are British victories, Allied victories, and German victories as well. Okay. This is a B-24 Liberator, shown here in a cross-section. It was the king of American bombers during the war, faster than previous planes and able to fly on longer missions while carrying more bombs. The planes like that will definitely come in handy in the Battle of the Atlantic. The German goal here is to disrupt supplies going to Britain and Russia from the United States. They fought in groups that they called wolf packs. And so the United States began organizing supply ships into convoys guarded by military ships. They would use new technology, radar, sonar, etc., to sink U-boats faster than the Germans could produce them. So the Battle of the Atlantic goes on for years. So there's a 1943, 1944, and 1945 maps of the Battle of the Atlantic. And again, it enlarges. Look at that. I planned ahead and I didn't even realize it. So you can see all those little dots All the red dots are where boats were sunk. All the blue dots are where merchant ships, so ships carrying supplies, were sunk. The red lines are operational units of shore-based aircraft, so that is where you have air support bombing happening on the U-boats. And then the little dashed blue lines are the main convoy routes, so the path that the boats were taking. The Battle of Stalingrad, that's one of those in the key concepts that we just looked at, was a battle to understand as a turning point in the war. It's the bloodiest confrontation of the war that leaves over 1 million dead, and it's very long. It lasts for 199 days. It's essentially a siege. The Germans need strategic materials in Russia. The Volga River in particular is an important supply route, and they would like to secure it. Their mistake is that they find themselves in Russia in winter, just like Napoleon does. They invade in September, but the Russian army knows that they do not have to defeat the Germans. There's an expression in Russian military history, and they say that General Winter is undefeated. So they just know that if they can outlast the Germans and keep the German soldiers in Russia, when the winter hits, that they will win. And that's exactly what happens. So the German army successfully surrounds Stalingrad. They begin starving them out, but then winter hits and they begin starving themselves. The Allies make a choice here to allow the Soviets to fight alone and not send in reinforcements. It is a point of significant soreness for Stalin, and a part of the reason for the distrust that happens between the U.S. and the USSR after the war. So, use the information on the map to summarize the course of World War II in Europe before the Battle of Stalingrad. So we are really seeing Germany move into Russia here up until 1942. Where are the Allies? Remember, they're in Africa. Stalin is wondering when they're going to get into Europe and open up a second front. Because if you imagine, if the Allies were to invade France, like they do on D-Day, what would happen to those lines that are headed into into the Soviet Union? At least a few of them would splinter off, right, and come back into France. And so Stalin is wondering why the heck the Allies are down in Africa fighting when they could be opening up a second front. In 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill meet and decide how they're actually going to move into Europe through this soft underbelly, through Italy. It's also during this time that the Royal Air Force and Americans begin to bomb Germany. They're going to be strategic. They're going to start bombing aircraft factories and railroads. And I forget who does what, but it's like the British will bomb during the day and the Americans will bomb at night, and it will just be sort of an around-the-clock campaign once it starts. Eisenhower, Patton, and Montgomery, who's a British general and an older man, they will be in charge of the invasion of Sicily in August, and by July, the Germans have fled that region. By July of 1943, Mussolini has been removed from power. Italy will surrender, but Germany will continue to fight. So Germany is now on the defensive, and the Allies plan to keep it that way. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill meet in Casablanca, Morocco, to plan their next move. The conference resulted in two important decisions. First, the Allies decided to increase bombing of Germany and invade Italy. Second, Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept only unconditional surrender, or giving up without any concessions. Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo could not hope to stay in power through a peace agreement. To be continued.